All right, what up, guys? Welcome back to another episode of the Living the Dream podcast. Today on the show, we are talking about waiting well. And I defined it as doing disciplined action for a long time, despite the result being far off. So when I think of waiting well, it makes me think of the parable. And I might get this parable a little wrong in the Bible because I did not review it before I did this episode, which would have been a smart thing to do. But hey, we're running with it, right? And I'm pretty sure there was this man and he like planted the seed in the ground, and maybe he went out to water it, maybe he just went out to watch it, but it's like he went out and he tended to it and he was waiting faithfully and he was sitting there, and the plant grew, but the man had no idea how it grew. And so similarly, I think there are things in our life where you simply do a disciplined action for a long amount of time, and the momentum starts to compound, and then things start to happen that are kind of inexplicable. It's like I've been doing 100 cold calls a year, or 100 cold calls a day for a year, and I've got nothing. And now all those people I called know my name, they're calling me back, they're sending me referrals, and all of my cold calls are generating leads now. Like maybe I out of every 1,000 calls I generate 20 leads, as opposed to I went a year without any leads. And so, which would be crazy if you did that. But hey, maybe some people who cold call are in that situation, right? And I think what's really important there is focusing on the action, focusing on the process, and being able to delay your gratification when it comes to the result. I think that's what waiting well really is. It's delaying gratification and switching gratification for immediate discipline. Immediate discipline, delayed gratification. I'm trying to coin a term. I don't know if that one will quite catch on, but that's really what we're talking about today. And where has it shown up in my life? I would say with this podcast, I made a commitment to myself to simply be consistent with the podcast. Like this podcast is here solely because I want to host a daily podcast. It's not really for the views, it's not really to monetize it, which as the year has gone on, like I started the podcast going daily on it probably about 9.5 ish months ago. And my views haven't really skyrocketed like I thought. My bank account doesn't look different because of the podcast. I've had to think of other ways to monetize other areas of my life. But I was like, this right here is building a character trait in me, which is consistency. And I need that character trait. Another character trait I've learned I need is focus. And that's one I'm building now with how I've structured my life. But the podcast is an example of me waiting well. There's some result that's far off where eventually this podcast will have generated a community of people that listen to the podcast solely to improve their life and to help the guests on the podcast improve their life. And so they will listen to the dreams of the guest, hear about how they can help or who they can introduce them to, and then reach out to that guest and try to make that introduction. That's the vision for the podcast. And ultimately, this podcast will be the backbone for Left with Love, which will be creating a community of 1 billion people that are all working to raise the standard of living across the world to middle class America. And how will we do that? You ask, well, it'll be a lot of one-on-one relationships and people in the community reaching outside of the community to pull people into the community, and we all grow together. We all improve our finances together, improve our health together, improve our mindset together. So that's the vision for the podcast. That result is so far off, but I'm posting daily now with that vision in mind. I also want to talk about it's shown up in my life in the last episode of the podcast. I talked about my intro and my outro, and I messed this word up on the last podcast, which was literally recorded 10 minutes ago. So I'm going to see if I can say it correctly now. But we were talking about depositing into a relational bank and withdrawing from a relational bank. The word I was messing up was withdrawal, which I messed it up again. I'm gonna work on saying that word. I promise you I'm gonna be able to say it. But a withdrawal from the bank is something when bro, you ask for something from the audience. That is a withdrawal. And I, at the end of every podcast, have been taking the time to be like, hey, rate the podcast. Hey, send this over to 1 to 3 friends. And maybe that's why my podcast hasn't grown. Every time somebody comes on the platform, they repeatedly get asked to do something. Whereas if they just came on, they received value, and I didn't ask anything of them, the law of reciprocity would kick in, and they'd be like, ooh, I've received so much value from Timmy, I'm just going to give value back. So I asked you guys, which I would still love for you to hit me up and be like, yo, I do think the relational withdrawals, there we go, there it is, are a little much, and you should maybe back off the asks and just provide value because you're great at that. I hope I'm great at that. I hope you think I'm great at that. If I'm not, tell me so I can get better at it. But yeah, that's what we talked about in the last episode. Relational bank account, inputs, outputs, deposits, withdrawals, and there we go again. I'm telling you, I got it. And so that's another way it's shown up in my life. Just waiting well. I'm questioning whether I'm waiting well in that scenario in my life, and if I can wait better with a better disciplined action, which is just adding value instead of asking for value. Honing in my focus to be consistent is another example of waiting well. This has been a recent change in my life as well, probably past 3-4 weeks. Instead of like doing 15 things for 15 businesses, I was like, hey, I'm going to do one thing for one business, and that is going to move the needle forward. And I'm going to be proud of that. I'm going to be happy of that. I will deem whether a day is successful or not by me doing this one thing. Everything else can still get done. But if I don't do this one thing, then I've slacked. Then it's not a successful day. I need to reevaluate my priorities, etc. Now, I've kind of criticized 2 areas of my life where I have been waiting poorly. The podcast is an example of me waiting well. I also want to highlight that I waited poorly in high school, and I did this because I didn't really have a vision for who I wanted to become. I was living other people's lives, and I think this is a horrible way to wait because waiting well means you do a disciplined action for a long time, despite the result being far off. But the only way you can wait well, I believe, is if you believe in the result that's far off. And so if you don't believe in the result that's far off, you get really caught up in just trying to avoid negative emotions as opposed to being disciplined for positive reasons. And so maybe discipline helps you avoid negative emotions, but I found that it's really hard for me to retain my discipline because I was waiting poorly in high school. I didn't build the habits of a disciplined person. I was just in a situation where it required discipline. And maybe I just need to create another situation that is as stressful, as emotionally distressing, that requires more discipline. But I don't really like hating myself. I had suicidal ideation at that point in my life. That's not really a place I want to go back to. And that was an example of me waiting poorly. I would say I was doing disciplined things, but it wasn't because the result was far off. It's because my freedom was far off, which was a result. But I don't think those actions necessarily led to that result, if that makes sense. And so I think it's when your disciplined action aligns with the result that you chose is when you have the why behind the discipline to wait well. And then you can wait poorly if you're just going towards a result that you don't care about. And that's waiting poorly because I think also behind this is just being proactive, taking initiative. I think when you're not being proactive, when you're not taking initiative, that's when you're not behind the result that you're trying to create because you're probably not trying to create one, which, if you don't try to create one, somebody will create one for you. And it probably won't be one that you like. Where do I want it to show up in my life? Just discipline in my health and income producing activities, continuing to work out well, continuing to eat well and eat better and improving upon that consistently, as well as focusing on my one thing that is generating revenue for my just life at that time. And eventually that income producing will change to impact producing. And right now I tie income with impact, but eventually it'll be impact outside of income, more about how much I can give in a monetary way, in a systems way, as opposed to like, look at that. I love the podcast because that y'all just exposed me on a limiting belief I have. Like even in my discipline in my health and income producing activities, I'm talking about how much money I want to receive, which is the same exact thing as me asking you guys to share this podcast and to rate it, right? But what I need to be focused on is how much value I can add. Maybe that's why I am where I am and why the podcast is where it is. Because I am kind of focused, not kind of, but I am focused on the income I'm receiving as opposed to the value I'm adding. So it shouldn't be a switch from income to impact. It should just be impact producing activities right now. So I'm going to change that. Thank you guys for that little therapy session. Shout out NF. But how can you apply it to your life? Focus on one action that is waiting well. And remember, we talked about waiting well as being a disciplined action that is aligned with a result that is far off, and you're delaying gratification and switching that gratification for immediate discipline. And then you are enjoying the process, enjoying the discipline because is taking you towards a result that you care about. And that result is typically impacting people. So even when I'm like focused on my impact producing activity, like right now, my job is to contact one broker on my list of 10 brokers every day and add value to them. And the idea behind that is it'll bring me deals. That deals will take me to my goals of financial freedom, which will help me impact my family. That financial freedom and impacting my family will give me the emotional healing because my heart hurts for my family. So when I help them, um, it'll be nice for me. It'll give me the emotional foundation, I'll say, to go expand and go help other people. Um, and I think I like that right now. So that is how you can wait well. Focus on one action that's aligned with a result that you care about. And it's typically going to be impacting somebody that you care about. So there we go. That is the podcast. Thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you next time.